Oh, yes, there is a difference, okay? My sister who lives in Los Angeles, a year and a half ago, she was like, how can we both be living in the same country, but our circumstances be so completely different? And this gives you an idea of what we're talking about when we say that there are regional differences and there are regional characteristics. We in this room here, we identify ourselves as Southerners. And so there is that, well, most of us do, I assume. So as Southerners, there becomes some regional things that, and phrases and values, just different things and mindsets and perspectives that we all kind of have in common that kind of unites us. Just like those that live maybe in New England would have their own set of culture, a subset of culture, or the Midwest, or the Pacific Northwest, or of course, California or the West Coast. And so different regions in this country have their own kind of things that they are dealing with, their own mindsets. And I don't believe it's any different in the days of Paul. So as Paul is writing this, we are going to find similarities between this letter to the people, the Colossian people, as well as some of these other places. And so there's some overlap. And specifically, one of the big overlaps is with the city of Ephesus. Ephesus is kind of closer to the coast, so it's west of Colossae. But we're going to go through. In fact, there's roughly like 18 different times that Ephesus and the book to Ephesians and the book of Colossians kind of overlap in some of their phrasing and some of their things. And so we see some of those common issues between the two cities. And so in the book of Colossians, I'm not going to read the introduction or the intro, so to speak, from Paul. This letter is written by Paul. And in the first 8 verses, he's kind of giving this introduction. He mentions Epaphras in the introduction, who is someone that this is the only place we know of him, and he's mentioned. And so we don't know a whole lot, but we do know that he's described as a dear fellow servant. He's described as a faithful minister of Christ, and ministers there. And if you do much research and understand that it is also believed that Colossae is the home to Philemon. Anybody know anything about the book of Philemon? And so there is some overlaps. Just trying to give some context there. But I want to begin reading in verse 9. And we're going to read 9 through 14 about, as Paul is getting into, and this is, we're going to call it his prayer. There's this prayer that he utters or writes and declares of the people of Colossae. And this is what he writes in Colossians 1, verse 9. For this reason, we also, since the day we heard it, we do not cease to pray for you and to ask that you may be filled with the knowledge of His will in all wisdom and spiritual understanding, that you may walk worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing Him, being fruitful in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of God, strengthened with all might according to His glorious power, for all patience and long-suffering with joy, giving thanks to the Father who has qualified us to be partakers of the inheritance of the saints in the light. For He has delivered us from the power of darkness and conveyed us into the kingdom of the Son of His love, in whom we have redemption through His blood, the forgiveness of sins. And so when we look at this and we read this prayer, we read this declaration, I guess maybe the first question that we have to ask when we first read it, and especially if you weren't able to follow it, you might be sitting there going, Pastor, what in the world did you just read? I understood about half of what you just read. Sometimes Paul gets kind of deep, doesn't he? He kind of phrases things, and so we're going to kind of try to break some things down. And breaking that down, I think we have to begin with this understanding of why. Why did Paul write this letter? Obviously, we understand the idea of addressing errors in the church and in the community and in the region, and hence some of the similarities between Colossians and Ephesians and even the 7 letters to the churches of Revelation. But ultimately, if I were going to put a nutshell, the reason that Paul is writing, the reason that God moves upon Paul to write this book is to guard the believers in the church, to guard them against the errors to which they have been exposed. And the reason I say to guard them, because when we read about the church in Corinth, for example, it's not in the same area. It's all the way over across the Aegean Sea. But the church in Corinth, if you studied much in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, what is Paul having to do? He's having to rebuke them constantly. You have messed up. This is not supposed to be the way it's done. He's trying to fix heresies. He's trying to fix things that they've let come in. And with Colossians, he's not chastising them, but he's addressing things that they need to be watchful for and guarded against, because there were philosophers of the time. There were things, and even people like Apollos. Apollos was someone that was teaching in the days of Paul, and while he was a servant of God, there were, we know, multiple inaccuracies that Apollos was teaching that Paul is continually having to kind of clean up and trying to correct. And so that's just one example of that. It's one of the interesting things, and I just want to kind of pause here. Colossians is one of the only two epistles that Paul writes. It's one of the only two epistles that Paul writes where, in addressing and guarding the people against something, that lying is specifically addressed. Ephesians and Colossians. And it's interesting. And so when we, just real quick, stay to Colossians 1, just for this example, flip over to Colossians 3 and verse 9. And in Colossians 3 and verse 9, it says, "Do not lie to one another, since you have put off the old man with his deeds and put on the new man, which is renewed in knowledge according to the image of him who created him." And so there is this declaration, and there's this. They've got the new creature. They're not still walking in flesh, but it's like, hey, just make sure that you're not lying to one another. When we flip over to Ephesians, flip backwards to Ephesians chapter 4, and look at verse 25 with me. In Ephesians 4:25, Paul puts it this way. He says, "Therefore, putting away lying, let each one of you speak truth with his neighbor, for we are members of one another." And so I just want to, I guess, in the terminology, there's not a rebuking, there's not a condemnation. It is simply a, hey, instructing us on what to be watchful for and to be guarded against. And so I would say that the purpose of Colossians is about guarding us as believers, guarding Christians, about the errors to which we have been exposed. How many of us have been exposed to the idea of lying? What does the world say today? The world says, oh, you can tell a little white lie. The world says, it's okay, it doesn't hurt anybody. And so there becomes this understanding that while we may not be having to guard against false teachings and false philosophies in the church, necessarily in our local church, we do understand that we are being influenced by those voices outside of these walls. We are influenced by the world itself. We are influenced even by, because there are false teachers in this world today. And so we have to make sure that we are guarding ourselves and that we are mindful of these things and that we go forward. Now, one of the things before we, I guess, get into any deeper, do we know for sure that Paul visited the city of Colossae? The answer is, in Paul's missionary journeys, the city of Colossae is never listed. So one of those conversations is, how does Paul know so much about Colossae? Just because it's not mentioned specifically doesn't mean that he didn't go there. So there's several different things. And when we look in the book of Acts, it talks about in the book of Acts, in Acts 15, Acts 16, Acts 18, that he's visiting the region of Phrygia. And it says that he visits the city or the region of Phrygia, and he goes to all the various major cities. He goes to these places, and he's teaching. And so when he visited there, know that he was traveling at that time, we know for sure, with Silas, and he was traveling with Timothy. And so the first time he goes through Phrygia, we know that, and that's in Acts 15 and 16, and it talks about that. And then we read later in Acts 18, on the same return trip or whatever, he goes to Athens, he goes to Philippi, and he visits the region of Phrygia on his way back to Jerusalem. And so we understand that going through that region, that there was some connection. We also know that there's personal knowledge of people that lived there. And so we understand and would assume that while it may not be specifically mentioned, he definitely would have been there. And so let's kind of talk about some of these things that he prays and declares over the people of Colossae and how it impacts us. In verse 9, what we see that at the beginning of our text, it said, for this reason. That means it's connecting it to something previously. So he's connecting the previous thought at verse 8. It says in verse 8, talking about Epaphras, that a fellow servant, faithful minister, it says, who declared to us your love in the Spirit. So the people of the church, the people of that place, are being described as, by someone who ministers there, you have love that is in the Spirit. It's a great thing. And so God goes on to continue that, and he says, for this reason, or on this account, or because you walk in this, or are known as this, having this love in the Spirit. And he goes on to, he says, and there's this long kind of interjection. For this reason, ever since we've heard that, we do not cease to pray for you. What's our tendency in our current context, our current culture, about prayer? I'm not saying, I think we all know this, what I'm about to say is not how it should be, but what is the tendency? When we hear somebody is going through something difficult, we are moved to pray for them. And that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. How often, though, do we think about someone and the good things that God is doing in their life and have the same burden to pray for them as well? Because that's what Paul is saying. Hey, I've heard that you have a love in the Spirit in your life, that you walk in this, and because of that, I don't stop praying for you. Think about that for just a moment. Why? Why is Paul moved and burdened to pray for people that, as far as what he's been told, that they have a love that is of God and that is in the Spirit? Go ahead, Dolette. She's about to burst over here, so.
It's because he is aware that the devil's going to even work on them harder because
Yes.
the devil sees that there's good there.
That's right. That's exactly right. And so there becomes that understanding. If there's good things that are going on, we immediately understand that there is going to be that spiritual warfare, that spiritual battle that is going to be happening. Because what does the enemy attempt to do? He is a liar. He is the father of all lies. He's going to steal, kill, and to destroy. And he is going to attempt to try to get us off track. And so for the people that he's writing to, God is wanting them to be covered in this prayer. And I would imagine that Paul is being motivated by this. I don't want this to see this be robbed or taken, or for the people to be distracted. And so because they have a love. And so I want to challenge us that we don't just need to pray for others and pray for people when they are down and out and when they're up against we need to pray for them then as well, but we don't just need to limit our prayers for them because they are in a struggle. But we need to see, when we see God moving and working, and so just like we'll take Easter this past Sunday morning, for example, when we see God moving in individuals' lives, and we see them receive a breakthrough or a blessing or changed, we need to be interceding for them even more so because we know that in walking out of that altar or walking out of that encounter with God, that they are going to experience a spiritual battle maybe that they may not even be prepared for or ready for. And so we need to do our part as believers and to love them, to encourage them, to pray for them, to intercede for them so that we can follow Paul's example. And that becomes a great thing to contemplate on and to think about. And so what is this prayer? He says, for this reason, I'm not going to stop praying for you. And in verse 9, the very first verse that we read, we see this initial request or this initial declaration to ask that you may be filled with the knowledge of His will in all wisdom and spiritual understanding. If I was going to simplify that, I'm going to say his prayer is that they have spiritual understanding. His prayer for them is that there will be a spiritual understanding and wisdom that they are able to be endued with and to be filled with and to be able to and to know. And so in other words, there is this desire that God has for the people, these believers that are walking in love in the Spirit, that they can have this perfected. By perfect, it doesn't mean without blemish. By perfected, it means completed. To have this completed knowledge of what God's will is in their lives. And this spiritual understanding of what God has for them. And I love this idea that this is a God's will without any restriction, without any limitation, without any hindrance. That they can be filled with the knowledge of what God's will is for them in every bit of wisdom and spiritual understanding. Just for a second, again, keep your bookmark or whatever and flip back over to Ephesians chapter 1. And as we go through this, there's going to be times that I think this is the last time tonight, but no promises. Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 17. Look at this, Ephesians 1 and verse 17. And this is, again, same region, further west of Colossae, and this is what God writes through this letter. Ephesians 1:17, that the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of glory, may give to you the spirit of wisdom and revelation in the knowledge of Him, the eyes of your understanding being enlightened. Y'all see those common words, that common theme, the common heartbeat, and so that we can find things. And the reason I bring these things out is because if we don't understand fully what it's saying in Colossians 1, in this particular case, we can also cross-reference it with what God is saying in the same heartbeat, in the same sentiment. How is it being phrased there? And sometimes those two things together help us to have a better understanding of what God is trying to say to us. And so if God is trying to fill us with the knowledge of His will, then what? Then what happens? Why does this become important to us? Why is this relevant to us that we can be filled with the knowledge of what God's will is for our lives? Just ponder for a moment. Think about it. Number one, if that happens, if God is moving and we have a full understanding, then that means that our spiritual wisdom is going to be enlarged. It's going to be expanded. How many of us want more spiritual wisdom? I think every single one of us. We want and need that wisdom that comes from God. God is the author and the source of all wisdom. And we need to pray for that on a daily, regular basis. God, fill me with your wisdom. Fill me with your understanding. And so I want this not just to be Paul's prayer for the people in Colossae, but I want this to be our prayer for one another, our prayer for ourselves, that we can say, God, fill me with that wisdom. Because when we have that full knowledge of His will, we can grow in that and have our spiritual vision of Him and what God has for us. We can have it to be enlarged and we can see more than maybe we thought before. Another thing that it does is that it removes kind of this fog that blocks our vision. Anybody ever be kind of thinking in God's spiritual terms that I'm here, but I'm in a fog, a spiritual fog? We've all dealt with that. We've at one time or another, we've been in those places where we're doing what we know we're supposed to do, but it's like we're numb. It's like there's this fog. There's this mist that blocks the vision. And one of the places that Tina and I, we love to go to is the Smoky Mountains. And when you're standing out on a balcony and you're looking out upon the Smoky Mountains, and it's in the morning especially, and you see that fog rolling in through the valley, and it covers the mountains, and even though you know it's right there, you can't see it. But in that moment, do I think that the mountain has been moved? No. I know it's still there. It's just covered by the fog. And so we don't have a hard time accepting by faith the things that we can't see but know are there. The mountain's still there. And so we need to have that same level of confidence and faith in the things of God, that God's will, even when I can't see it, even when I can't see His will, even when I can't see His working in my life, can I can I have an understanding and a faith to know with confidence that His will is still there, even if it's in the fog? And so when we say, God, oh Lord, fill me with the knowledge of your will, let me have a spiritual understanding. That understanding means that the fog kind of lifts, and all of a sudden we understand and we see and we get a glimpse of that. And we need to operate in that and to say, God, I need that fog to be lifted. I need my vision of you and my vision of your will. I need my vision of what you have for me to be lifted. And we need to pray that. And I wish that it happened as quickly as it maybe happens in the Smoky Mountains when a good wind comes in or the sun comes out. All of a sudden it moves out and we can see again. But it doesn't always happen that quickly for us, does it? But we still have to hold on. And we still have to press in. And because when that fog becomes removed, it gives us this burning desire for more understanding, for more knowledge of His truth, for more wisdom. Because when God begins to reveal His will to us, and when we're walking in that eventually at some point there becomes this passion and this desire saying, God, I want to grow. I want to know more. I want to be able to experience more. And I want to be able to see things that I never saw before in spiritual eyes. I want to have this spiritual understanding and see things in this. And so my prayer for us today is that God give us this spiritual understanding of what you would have for us, and for you to be able to move and to work in a mighty way, to be able to see what He would have us to see. And so God, give us your spiritual understanding. Second thing that he goes on to say, in verse 10, he says that you may walk worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to Him. It continues on, and we're going to expound on that in just a minute. But so the second part of this prayer is to walk worthy. Walk worthy. Now, if we were to go around the room, if we have an accurate, humble perspective of ourselves, I think every single one of us would acknowledge and know and realize none of us are worthy of Him. We're just not. None of us are. So what does this mean when He tells us to walk worthy? I believe that it literally is referencing and commanding us to walk. If we're going to walk worthy, it means that we're going to yield to His Spirit and to walk in such unison with His Spirit that we are exhibiting the examples and the characteristics of Him and His Spirit. His purity, His humility, His love. When we think about those things, now, to walk worthy of Him, while we may not be worthy in the fullness of the sense, through Christ, who are we? As believers, who are we through Christ? Christ says that when He lives in us, that He is our righteousness. And so while we in our humanity may not be worthy, Christ living in us is, of course, worthy and our righteousness. So that when we are walking worthy in Him, we are walking step in step. This past, was it February, we had snow? I love getting enough snow where it covers all the blades of grass. And you just get that white blanket of snow, right? Well, of course, what do we still have to do at our household, regardless of how beautiful that white blanket of snow is, regardless of how cold it might be? There is a four-legged, furry, golden animal in my house that still has to go to the exterior, okay? Y'all, I know I'm crazy, I'm weird, but just bear with me here for a second. When I'm walking the dog, guess what I will do? I know that I can't control where he steps, but I can control where I step. And so I will walk out to a specific area with the dog, let him do his business, and then I will walk back trying to step in the exact same places that I stepped in order to keep as much smooth snow as possible. Am I the only weird one in the room? I just like that look, okay? I like that. Okay, so I'm not the only one. Some other people are confessing that they're like me. So that's just kind of, and so it becomes that element. And so I reference that because when I think about this idea, this word picture of walking worthy, we can't ever be worthy. But if we're walking in the steps of Christ, it's not our steps that have to be worthy. If we're walking step in step, hand in hand with Jesus Christ, then all that matters is his steps are worthy. And his steps are always worthy. And so we need to be able to say, okay, Jesus, where are your footprints? Okay, God, I'm watching. And of course, I think most of us remember the old poem, the footsteps in the sand. And so we need to, that poem ends with, there's only one set of footprints. And of course, those are the times that Jesus carries us. So the only set of footprints you're seeing are his. And so I would say and argue in our lives, there always needs to be just one set of footprints, his, and we're walking in his, and we're following him. And so when we walk worthy, as it declares, when we are, that we may walk worthy of the Lord, this is what's going to happen. We're going to be pleasing to him. It means that we're going to be fruitful, not fruity, fruitful, okay? That we... Y'all got me tickled now. So that we're going to be fruitful. And of course, we're connecting it. How do we know that we're being fruitful? The first place that we look to is the fruit of the Spirit. Are the fruit of the Spirit being exhibited in our life? Are we walking in love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and gentleness and self-control? And faithfulness? Are we walking in those? Are those things being borne out in our life? Are other people able to see that fruit? And so when we're walking worthy, these are the things that are going to happen. We're going to be pleasing to him. We are going to be fruitful in every good work. And we are going to be increasing in the knowledge of God. That we're going to be increasing in our knowledge and our understanding of who he is. And so we need to be walking with Jesus. We need to be, that whole idea of being yoked with him and being able to know that God is with us and able to move in a mighty way. And so we continue. And so this prayer, that we need to have spiritual understanding and that we need to be able to walk worthy. And then verse 11, we have this, that we are strengthened with all might. So this third element of the prayer is that we are strengthened. It gets weary, doesn't it, in life? Some weeks harder than others. Tired, weary. Do I have to get up? I saw a meme the other day. I think it was yesterday. And it was a lady sitting at her desk, and she's like, "Praise God, I made it through another work day." And then the next picture was her at that same desk in the same outfit, same clothes, and she's crying her eyes out. And she says, "And I just realized I have to do it all over again tomorrow." We feel like that sometimes, don't we? We get through a day and we feel accomplished, and then there's the realization we've got to do it all over again. And it gets weary. And so we need this prayer. We need this. God, I need to be strengthened. And what I love about this being strengthened, it's not just with some might, but with all. Strengthened with all might. And whose power, whose might is this based on? What's the measuring stick of all? I mean, all of my patience may be this, okay? But all of a mom's patience may be much higher, okay? All our moms are patient, right? Usually. Ask Lloyda about her patience as a mom today. She had an adventure with Jeremiah today. But we all understand that the measuring stick of what is all might is not us. The measuring stick here is what it says there in verse 11, is his power. Not just his power, but his glorious power. That means we're talking about a heavenly power. We're talking about a divine power. We're talking about a Shekinah glory power. And that is the measuring stick of the strength that the prayer is that we will be filled with, that we can be strengthened with all might according to his glorious power. Do we really believe that that's possible? Because if we believe that that's possible, then this becomes a regular part of God. I need your wisdom and spiritual understanding. God, I need your help to walk worthy in your steps. And God, I need to be strengthened with all power of your might. Because this is what happens when we do. When we are strengthened with every bit of his might, then it says there in verse 11, that we have patience and a patience with joy. I love that clarification. Long-suffering, obviously, New King James says patience and long-suffering. Some of your translations may even combine that, I don't know. But it's not just patience, but it's a patience with joy. I've confessed to you, I can be the most impatient person at times. Other times I can be patient. I guess it depends on the situation. But that idea of being patient, are we patient or are we joyfully patient? I fail at the joyfully patient. I confess. But when we are filled and strengthened with his might, the purpose of that is so that we can be joyfully patient. So pray for the joyful patience. But more importantly, God, let me be strengthened by the power of your might. And let that be the case. Okay? I love here that the fourth thing. So spiritual understanding, walking worthy, strengthened and being strengthened. And then in verse 12, that we get to be partakers of the inheritance. We have an inheritance, folks. And we get to partake of it. And that we get to be able to partake of it, I believe, not just when we get to heaven, but we get to be partakers of that inheritance now, here on heaven. That what did Jesus command us to do? He commanded us to be able to say, God, let the kingdom of heaven be evidenced on earth. And the whole idea of his idea of encountering us with those things and encountering us so that we can be able to be partakers and to experience the inheritance and to experience the things that God has for us. What are those things that God has for us? What are those things that God is able to give us in terms of inheriting? Then there are things of joy, there are things of that strength, there's things of breakthrough, and there's things of the things that we get into in this last element here of the prayer, in that is the deliverance of the power of darkness, from the power of darkness. There in verse 13. This is a declaration that Paul makes, but I include this as part of this prayer because I believe it's a statement and a declaration by faith. I guarantee you that there were people in Colossae that that they were experiencing oppression, they were experiencing battles, they were experiencing struggles, just like us. But he's reminding them that we have already been delivered from the powers of darkness, and we have been brought into the kingdom that God has for us. I think I have shared. I know I've shared it before. I don't remember if it's on Wednesday or Sunday, but when I was in college, we went to the best example I have when we talk about darkness is when we went with a bunch of college guys to the Lost Sea up in Tennessee, between Knoxville and Cleveland, and there at the Lost Sea, they have during the day you go in and you do the tour and it's lit up and you get out on a boat and there's fish and all that kind of stuff. But we didn't do just the normal standard kind of tourist tour. We did the after hours, spend the night in the cave tour, okay? And so what that meant is we went through the basic main tour, but then we all go in, we set up our tents in this huge cave, and we're standing there. And they tell us to stand still, and they kill the lights. I have never experienced darkness like that. I mean, it was freaky. I mean, you're like, I have no idea what's going on. And all of a sudden your hearing becomes, and it was like, okay, what was that? What was that sound? What was that sound? What was that sound? And so they turned the lights back on, and we got to keep going. And of course, later on, eventually the lights went out. But they were doing that to prepare us for what darkness really was. And so, I mean, literally, I remember holding up my hand and had no idea that I could not see my hand. And there was a buddy standing next to me, and it was like, are you still there? I mean, and so there becomes that, just to be that in that kind of darkness. And I think about that spiritual darkness and that oppression. But here it is that God declares that we have already been delivered from that power of darkness. We've already been set free. We have already been given that breakthrough. We have already been conveyed. Because notice here that this is a past tense verbiage. He has delivered us. He has conveyed us. And this is not a future tense. This is a past tense. The work has already been done. God has already done it through the cross, through the resurrection. And we get to come tonight, and we can be able to celebrate that, God, I want to have that inheritance already walking and living and existing in my life, a deliverance from that power. I love that word, He has delivered us from the power of darkness. In the Amplified Version, it says, He has rescued us. He has rescued us from the power and drawn us into Himself and out of the dominion of darkness. And so that we get to come today and we get to know that God is truly with us. And He is expressing God is using Paul to not just express gratitude for who they are, but he's praying over them. He's reminding them, hey, these are things that I know that you have this love in the Spirit. I know this is already evidenced in your life. And so therefore my prayer is that you will have a spiritual understanding, that you will be able to walk worthy, that you will be able to be strengthened by the power of God in your life, that you will already be able to partake in the inheritance, and that you will walk in the deliverance and the rescue from the darkness and from the powers of darkness that God has already done in our lives. And there becomes the reality of where you and I are and what we need to live in by faith and what we need to walk in, that they can be thankful. And if they can be thankful, then guess what? We can be thankful tonight. And let these elements be part of our prayer life. Let us say, God, I need to walk in your wisdom. I need to have that spiritual understanding grow. I need to be able to walk worthy. I need to be able to, so that I can be fruitful, that I can increase and all of those things. And I need to be strengthened with the power of your might, because that's what God desires, because there's an inheritance, not just in heaven, but now. And He wants to deliver us because He's already provided for it. Will we accept it? Will we pursue it? Will we walk in it? So as we close tonight, I just want to pray with you, pray for you, that God will truly lead us out. If you're walking in darkness right now, that He will lead you out of that darkness, because He's already provided the rescue and He's already provided the deliverance. And that you will be able to begin to partake of the inheritance. And the prayer can be answered of spiritual understanding, of walking in the steps, walking worthy because of Christ, being strengthened by Him. So let us pray. Dear Heavenly Father, God, I thank you and I praise you that, Lord, that God, we're able to come before you tonight. And that, God, that we can be mindful, God, and be celebratory, God, of what you have already done for us. And so, God, I pray that in each and every one of our lives, that we will be mindful in remembrance, and we will declare, even if it's by faith, God, that because we don't see it right now in this very moment, but God, we know, that Lord, that God, that you have delivered us, you have rescued us from the power of darkness, from the dominion of darkness, God, and that, God, that in that rescuing, in that deliverance, God, you have brought us into the kingdom of light. You have brought us into the kingdom of heaven. And so, God, as we do this and as we walk this this. God, I pray that right here and right now, oh, that God, that you will let us declare over our lives, declare in our family, God, that we will, oh, be able to have a spiritual understanding, a wisdom and an understanding of what your will is. And that, God, that as we do, that, God, that you will lift that fog, that you will lift that, that haze that may be hindering us, God, and that we will walk worthy of you, walk worthy of your steps, God, and walk in you, walk in such harmony with your Spirit that, God, that there becomes no denying, God, that there is fruit being born out in our lives. God, I pray that, Lord, that you will help us to be strengthened today. God, this life, this rat race, it becomes wearisome, it becomes overwhelming. And so, God, I pray that right now that you will just strengthen each and every one of us by your power, with all your might, God, and that, Lord, that in that strength, that, God, that we have the power not just to get up in the morning, but, God, the power to let your light and your joy shine in us and through us, God, that as we deal with setbacks or as we deal with frustrations, God, that we can still have a sincere joy in our heart and a joy and a smile on our face, God, and that, Lord, that we will be truly able to testify that you have strengthened us by heaven's power, God. And so, Lord, let it be so. God, we love you today. We praise you in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. For those watching online, thank you so much. God bless you. We'll see you next time.